And welcome to another edition of Krown Gridiron Nation on TSN, presented by PointsBet. There's Mike in Toronto, Gord is in Vancouver, and I'm Jim on Football Island, ready to give you another edition of the 2-Minute Offense. Jared Wayne had another big day, found his way into the end zone, but it wasn't enough for 17th ranked Pitt, a narrow loss to Miami. Rutgers with an upset win over Illinois by a major score. Both the Brown brothers had a solid game, and you'll be hearing more about them later. Alonzo Adai with 6 tackles and a fumble recovery. Akeem Messidor with 4 tackles and a TFL. And it was enough for West Virginia to get by Iowa State. Nick Mardner was his solid, reliable self with 4 receptions for 32 yards, but Utah State lit up the scoreboard just a little bit more. Damian Alford with another grab. Jeffrey Cantonar-Coup with 6 tackles and a forced fumble as Syracuse gets by Boston College. Luigi Villan with 4 tackles as Wake Forest continues on their tear. A blowout win over Duke. Enoch Mcconzo with 11 tackles overall, but only one of them was a solo. Still, that's a great number and a better win for Coastal Carolina. Daniel Joseph with 6 tackles and a half sack. NC State cruises easily to a win over Louisville. And defensive back Dean Leonard makes 6 tackles, but the Ole Miss offense goes missing, goes absent for the first time this year in a loss to Auburn. Theo Johnson with his biggest day yet for Penn State. 4 catches, 41 yards. Jesse Luketa with 7 tackles and a TFL, but Penn State is on a 2-game skid. Guys, we have a good sample size now from stateside. So who have been the best of the players who were drafted in the CFL and then went back to the NCAA for a year, Gord?
You know, there are a lot of these guys that have had kind of underwhelming seasons. You know, I look at a guy like Daniel Joseph, after 6.5 sacks and 10.5 tackles for loss last year, he's on pace for less in both of those categories this year, which I think would qualify as a mild disappointment. We're seeing quite a bit of that across the board. 2 guys that have had strong seasons, though, that I really like. Liam Dobson steps up a little bit in play, moving into the FBS and playing at Texas State. He's been really great holding down the right guard spot on that line for them. And then the other guy that stood out for me, another guy taking a step up in competition this year, has been Mo Diallo, who may even be playing himself into UDFA late round consideration in the NFL, as he's been a standout on what's by all accounts a pretty terrible Arizona team this year. But him moving up from MAC competition in Central Michigan to Pac-12 competition and keeping his production up, I would say that's nothing but positive news for Mo Diallo.
I think I'm contractually obligated to talk about our guy with the Argos, and that's Sage Dockstader, who was a second-round draft pick for us this year. He's big. He's 6'8". He's about 350 pounds. And at New Mexico State, they had a tough start of things offensively and have seemed to get better and better and better every week. And it seemed, you know, from our standpoint, we were pretty happy to see that it was the right side of the line for New Mexico State that was struggling a little bit more than the left side. So we're pretty happy with the way that things have progressed down there for Big Sage Dockstader.
So which NCAA players are destined for the CFL and which are destined for some kind of look or even longer stay in the NFL in your mind, Gord?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of guys. If you're looking down the line a year or two, that's where I'm really looking for guys that are emerging right now. And I don't believe either of these guys are eligible for this upcoming year's draft. But a couple of guys that are really emerging, Nick Mardner, we've talked about a lot on this program. He's a junior, as many of the CFL draft eligibles are, but I believe he's next year eligible for the draft. And the other guy whose stock is trending way up, in my opinion, is Matthew Bergeron, who has been starting most of the season at Syracuse. He's just a sophomore, so he's a year or two away yet. But those are a few guys to keep your eyes on down the road that I'm really liking the way they're trending right now. And in terms of a guy who's in this year's draft, I think Tavius Robinson is continuing to trend up as well. There's still a bit of a dearth of Canadian rush talent, especially in certain markets in the CFL right now, that really need some juice on that line. And Robinson's frame has to be something that has them just drooling at 6'8" and 240, a guy who's now battle-hardened in the SEC. I think that he's a guy that's really shooting up people's draft boards. In terms of guys who are getting interest down south, I mean, I think Alonzo Adai continues to play really strong. Another guy that I think could sneak into the conversation down south that is supposedly in this year's draft is Enoch Mcconzo, who I think is just so versatile on the defensive side of the ball. that there will be some NFL team that just can't pass him up. And then a guy I think is a slam dunk to go to the NFL is Jesse Luketa in this year's draft as well.
Time for the best of the North, playing in the heart of the South. It's the one and only Stateside 5. It's not 200 plus, but it was a decent day for London, Ontario's Chase Brown. 74 yards from scrimmage, 69 on the ground. He now has 704 yards with 3 games remaining. The biggest day yet for Toronto's Paris Shand with Arizona, 4 tackles, 1.5 TFL in his first sack of the year in a loss to USC. 7 tackles and a sack for Lethbridge D-end Isaiah Bagna in the Broncos' win over Colorado State. The Bagman is up to 6 sacks this season. Here's some good news for the Edmonton Elks. Their draft pick Dominic Johnson had another standout day for the Buffalo Bulls. 4 catches, 96 yards, and a tutty in a 56-44 loss to Bowling Green. And 6 catches, 78 yards, and a trip to the Promised Land for Peterborough, Ontario's Jared Wayne in a narrow loss to Miami. Wayne now has 1,002 yards receiving in just under 3 years at Pitt. Coming up, the playoff hour is nigh in USports. Welcome back, everyone. Who is out and who is moving on in our USports visit, known as the 3-minute warning. Laurier Waterloo. This was a 3-point game until we headed towards the 4th when Waterloo ripped off 25 unanswered points. Trey Ford, the leader for the Warriors, with 290 passing yards and an additional 97 on the ground. Guelph and Mac. The McMaster defense stopped Guelph 3 times in the red zone to pull this one off. But would it be too little, too late for McMaster? Earlier this year, we asked, are the Windsor Lancers for real? The answer, the Western Mustangs are for real. Deontay Knight there with a scoop and score, and backup Evan Hillock goes 15 of 23 for 321 and 2 TDs in the wipeout. St. FX scored for the cycle in their pillaging of St. Mary's. Fumble recovery TDs, fake field goal TDs, you name it, they did it, and they remain perfect. Mount Allison has won games with special teams this year. Against Acadia, it was no exception. James Kick Parker with 2 plus 40-yard field goals were the difference. Concordia Sherbrooke. The Stingers kind of limped into the playoffs after this TD loss to Sherby. One guy that wasn't limping was Jimmy Jobert, 179 yards on the ground and a TD for the green and gold. Out west we go, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the Huskies are the team to beat in the West. No doubt about it, a convincing win over Manitoba. Mason Nyhouse taking the lead for Canada West MVP, I think. 246 and 2 TDs through the air. T-Birds Dinos. Jurassic Park teaches us that dinos can be one of 2 things, angry or extinct. Calgary chose anger, up 25-0 after 1. 39-7 at the half. Tyson Philpott, the angriest of all, 7 catches, 214 yards, and 3 TD. Rams and the GBs. Regina needs to find a way to stop games after 45 minutes, not just stop playing in them. They were up 22-5. Fourth quarter rolls along. They let Alberta score 18 unanswered, including a TD off a fumble in the end zone off a wide field goal. My goodness. Queens has home field advantage the rest of the way in the OUA. They draw Carleton in the semi, while Ottawa travels to Toronto. This took more than a few minds to figure out the tiebreak. Mac is the odd team out of the playoff mix. In the Q, Montreal hosts Sherbrooke and Laval hosts Concordia. The Stingers are 0-2 versus the Rouge et Or this season. And to the AUS, where St. FX remains undefeated and in first place with a week to go. And outside of first spot, the Canada West is wide open, and we'll have more on that in just a minute. So, what have we learned from the OUA's 2-division experiment, Michael?
I don't think we really learned a heck of a lot. I think we knew that the power was going to be in the West. it was. We knew that one pretty good team was going to make the playoffs. They did, McMaster. We knew that one team in the West was going to be unhappy with the schedule, and in this case it was Windsor, who got stuck playing Western twice, missed the playoffs by a game after 2 losses to the Mustangs, despite the fact that they beat the number 5 team in the country in successive weeks. What we didn't learn how good Queens is. We know that they're really good on the east side. They played Guelph. That was their toughest battle of the season, even though they're undefeated. We just don't know how good they are. One thing that I did learn, though, from this is that I think that a Final Four in this country featuring Can West, Quebec, OUA East, and OUA West would be a hell of a lot more entertaining than what we have now.
Yeah, agreed. And I think there are still some things that we've yet to learn about this 2-side model, including how does this affect Queens going through the playoffs? Is this going to be something where, assuming, as they've kind of dominated the East, assuming that they continue to roll through and make it through the Yates Cup final, which I know is a big assumption, but how is this going to affect them? Are they going to be fresher for that Yates Cup final? Are they going to have more energy left in the tank? Or are they going to be maybe not quite as sharp as, say, just to pick an example, a Western team that has run through the gauntlet of the West in the first 2 rounds of the playoffs? So that's something I find quite interesting that still the jury is out on. But I think what I've seen, what we've learned, is that if they can find a way to even up the team numbers, this is the ideal model for the OUA rather than this gargantuan 11-team monster conference. The 6 and 5 is a little bit awkward. There's a lot of buys mixed in there. Some teams got crossovers, some teams didn't. So that's a little bit tricky. If they can find a way to add a 12th team somewhere, that would be fantastic. And I think that this model would work out really well in that case. But as it currently stands, I still think it's better than the 11-team mega conference myself, but it is a little clunky with the odd numbers of the 6 and 5.
Well, the answer is this, boys. The OUA and Quebec merge into 2 divisions of 8. That's how it works. Moving on, everyone has played at least one another once in the Canada West. So we come down to the final week this week. And how does it all settle, Gord?
Oh, it could be all over the map, guys. I mean, the guys that we thought were clear favorites, the teams we thought were clear favorites, the Manitoba Bisons 2 weeks ago, we thought were clear favorites. They've lost 2 straight since then and have fallen back to the pack. I still think that Saskatchewan looks like the class of the conference this year. And so the game that I'm watching is a rebounding Calgary team that is chock full of talent, guys, but not necessarily chock full of experience across the field. That is still kind of finding their way. They stomped UBC this past weekend in a game they absolutely had to have, and they either need to win or get some help in order to get in, and they need to win at Saskatoon. So that's the game that I'm watching because that game's going to have a ton of implications. But any of these teams can beat any of these teams. We've already seen that this season. Nobody's out of it. Nobody's running away with it. It's going to be really fun, guys, and I'm glad that I don't have to handicap it.
I will admit freely I had Calgary as my number 1 team at the beginning of the season, and the fact that they may miss the playoffs astonishes me. And it could happen. I mean, it's not going to be easy for UBC to beat Alberta, even though the game is at UBC, but it's doable. And if Saskatchewan at the same time can beat Calgary, they're out. Now, what happens if Alberta wins, Manitoba wins, and Calgary wins? Then you get Saskatchewan and Calgary in the first round, and one of the beasts, with no disrespect to the other 2 teams finishing 2nd and 3rd, I would think that Saskatchewan and Calgary would be sort of the co-favorites at this stage of the season. One of them is going to be out in the first round, so the way that it stacks up right now, I really think we're going to see USask and Calgary play in round 1, and oh boy, is there going to be a pretty good team on the sidelines very quickly in the West.
Next up, it's the receivers in the Great Canadian GOAT Search. Welcome back. Here are your CJFL standings on the road to the Canadian Bowl. 1 game left in the OFC regular season. Windsor's St. Clair Fratman in control in first. The Langley Rams lose their first on the final week, while Kamloops wins for the first time since 2017. And it's playoff time in the Flatlands, now with Regina in the driver's seat. Before we get to goat herding, we have a contest. All roads seem to lead through Kingston on this show, so we have a copy of Gale Force. Follow and retweet the contest tweet at KGN at TSN. The winner will be chosen at random from a random user generator online after a week. Now it's time for our PointsBet Canadian GOAT Search. We are picking the top Canadians in each position based on their college careers. We'll announce the full team at the end of the season. And so far, we've done quarterbacks, running backs. So up next, naturally, is receiver, and we will break it down by era. First, in the foundational group, it's Tom Forzani, who led the NCAA in receiving in 1972 while at Utah State, versus Brian Fryer, who was the first to break the 1,000-yard barrier in Canada at Alberta, and he was drafted by the Washington football team. In the next-gen group, Western's Andy Fantuz versus Jerome Pathon, who started at Acadia, won Rookie of the Year, led the nation, then finished his last 3 years at Washington before he had a long career in the NFL. And in the Generation Now group, Chase Claypool, Josh Palmer, and Curly Kittens Jr. Mike, that last one was for you. By the way, who do you have in each of the eras for the PointsBet GOAT receiver? Who are your top of your class?
Okay, let's get in the Wayback Machine, and I'll go with Brian Fryer from Alberta. In an era in the 70s when in Eastern Ontario, we didn't hear very much about the other conferences around the CIAU at the time. We knew about Brian Fryer, a Heck Crichton winner, and a couple of times he was All-Canadian, and, you know, just being a part of that Vanier Cup team, we'd see the Vanier Cup every year. But that was about, you know, all we knew, and he was maybe the only guy we knew from another conference. He was spectacular, and you know, all of those discussions were justified when we found out that he had signed with the Washington Redskins. So he was spectacular, and I'll go with him from that era. Middle one is easy for me, and that's Andy Fantuz at Western. 4 times an All-Canadian, obviously 4 times an OUA guy, and like Fryer, a guy who won the Crichton. He came in as a freshman and caught 1,300 yards worth of footballs. He was just spectacular. By the time he graduated, he had 2 of the top 3 all-time receiving yardage numbers. He had massive hands. If you took him to a combine, he'd never win a race against everybody. He wouldn't necessarily stand out, but he was so disciplined in his routes, so smart, and had such great soft hands. He's my middle guy. And the last guy I'm going to bring up, if you have watched this show over the last half decade, you know all about Curly Kittens Jr. because every week we seemingly had a highlight reel catch from him. 4 times he was an OUA All-Star, 2 times he was an All-Canadian, set the USPORTS record with 75 catches in a season. He's just been a dynamite example of how good OUA athletes can be. And while the guys on the south of the border had higher profiles perhaps with other teams in the NCAA, you can't, from the collegiate level, underestimate what Curly Kittens Jr. did.
For me, as I cracked into the archives of the days of yore in Jim Mullen's youth, I dragged up a name that was quite familiar to me in Forzani, and a name that's familiar to most Calgarians out there, Tom Forzani, a standout receiver going down to Utah State. And we talk about Chuba Hubbard as a trailblazer for Canadians, as a guy that set NCAA records. Well, Forzani led the NCAA in receptions and was second in receiving yards across the entire country in 1972 at Utah State. Then came up here, had a successful CFL career, and now, of course, is a successful entrepreneur, one-time owner of the Sports Check Group. So Tom Forzani, a guy that stands out for me from that era. In the middle era, you know, Mike, you talked about a guy that came in and blew the doors off of CIAU at that point in time as a freshman. Let's talk about Jerome Pathon, guy from North Vancouver, goes across to Acadia, catches over 1,000 yards worth of balls as a freshman, and then decides, you know what, this may have been a little bit too easy for me, and transfers down to the University of Washington. He ends up catching balls from Peyton Manning in the NFL and Drew Brees and some of those other guys, and so that's a standout resume quality right there for me. And then the guy from the modern era, I mean, I don't know that there's much more that we can say about Chase Claypool, but I have never seen in my lifetime another Canadian receiver right from the prep school ranks who was so dominant coming up and so much of a standout all the way through his college career and into the NFL, as we've seen Chase Claypool do so far. John Mechie may very well change that narrative within the next 2 years here, but for now, Claypool is my runaway guy from that modern era.
In the foundational category, it's Tom Forzani versus Brian Fryer. Fryer was the first player over 1,000 yards receiving in CIS history, and Tom Forzani was Canada's first All-American who led in an offensive category. I'm going with Forzani. It's a difficult decision. Next up, it's Gen Next featuring Jerome Pathon and Andy Fantus. Fantus, the all-time leader in receiving yards in USPORTS history. On the flip side, Jerome Pathon, one of the best receivers all time at the University of Washington. Had a great NFL career, but we're talking college here, and Fantus was huge in this country. I'm going with Fantus. And lastly, it's Curly Kittens Jr. versus Chase Claypool. You might think this is a wash for Claypool, but the numbers are great for Kittens, and he was also fantastic when it came to special teams. But you got to go with Claypool, a four-year starter at Notre Dame. Remember, you can vote all weekend at KGN on TSN. Coming up next, it's our NCAA picks. Okay, time for NC2A picks. Gord had back-to-backs, but never got on a streak. Lost last week. Gord, time to get back to your winning ways.
Well, you know, I'm not going to take anything easy here, but I think we do need to pay a little bit more attention to Wake Forest even than we have been so far. Now, I know we've talked about Luigi Villain this season, the transfer from Michigan, who is now having a strong starting season at Wake Forest. But Wake Forest has been one of the great surprises of the NCAA season. Undefeated at 8-0, now up to 10th ranked in the country, and they're entering into a strong home stretch for them that will either make or break their season, starting with this week's game against the North Carolina squad that took number 11 Notre Dame deep into the game last week, losing by just 10 on the road. This game's in Chapel Hill. It's going to be a tough test for Wake Forest, and they are currently a dog by a couple of points. So I'm going to take Wake as the underdog here to win this big one on the road and continue their ascendancy, because I just really love what's going on there. And I'll tell you this much, if you're a football fan, you need to go watch that game they had against Army a couple weeks ago. Something like 1,400 yards in combined offense, 140 points. That game was fun as all get out, guys. And I want to see Wake Forest keep the ball rolling here.
Can you imagine if we had turned back the clock a couple of years and we'd be talking about an Alabama-LSU game where one of the teams was favored by 4 touchdowns? That's what we have here, Alabama and LSU. The Tigers are obviously reeling a little bit with their coaching future up in the air, and they simply cannot run the football. So I'm thinking, if I'm on the Alabama side and knowing the sort of the blood rivalry that they have with LSU, that if they have the opportunity to step on a franchise and a program when it's down, they're going to take full advantage of that. So guys, when they have a reunion 25 years from now, said, remember that day we beat LSU by 40? They may do that this week. It's a real mismatch, and as long as Alabama keeps its starters in, they could win this game way, way big. So I'm reluctant to do it, but I'm going to give up the 28.
For everyone here on Krown, Gridiron Nation, this is Jim Mullen saying, let's get out to the game.